seekers back at the time.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. um, and where basically I would say the AFD framed and communicated around that case in a way that it basically reversed subject, perpetrator and victim position and offered contemporary Germans the subject position of the victim of criminal immigrants rather than feeling as historical perpetrators and sort of feel negative feelings of guilt and shame towards the past. In the second case I was looking at, that was the elections in Eastern Germany in 2019, so exactly 30 years after the fall of the wall and the so-called peaceful revolution. That's also where the quote for the title that Alex mentioned earlier came from, where on the one hand, they capitalized a lot on feelings of precarity and feelings of living in a GDR 2.0 among Eastern Germans, so actively using the memory of the GDR and of the lack of freedom, and claiming that the current government back then, still under Angela Merkel, would basically be a GDR 2.0 that would not allow you to utter your opinions freely, for example. And on the other hand, they also offered the contemporary Eastern German voters a possibility, I would say, to feel like the revolutionaries again, to feel like the heroes of democracy again, basically by voting for the AFD and resisting what was portrayed as a GDR 2.0 today. And in the third case, I looked at their election campaign in 2021 that had that was sort of held under the in Germany, but normal, and where I essentially argue that they offered contemporary Germans a notion or a longing to be normal again, to live in a normal, or what they would at least conceptualize as normal Germany again. First of all, by constructing contemporary Germany as it was back then in 2021 as feeling abnormal. One thing here, of course, was sort of the long shadow of the COVID pandemic and the restrictions and all unfreedoms that people experienced, but it also was a lot about a German culture on a very sort of everyday individual level. On the one hand, as we can see here, a Facebook post about a worried mother who is worried about her child not learning German anymore because nobody in her daughter's school speaks it anymore. Or also focused about, on high culture, on Schiller and Goethe and German, language and tradition, and also claimed to be invested in protecting the German democracy and the German basic law, so basically our German constitution. But what also played an essential role, I would argue, in allowing Germans to feel normal again was sort of countering Germany's what you could maybe call ultimate abnormally, its past and its relationship to the past, and the genocide it committed, by basically, I would say, omitting any memory of the Holocaust. It barely features in AFD's Facebook or in AFD's social media activities, and trying to rebuild, what we could maybe call a positively connotated memory culture that allows positive feelings about the past and a positive identification with figures in the German past, especially German resistance fighters and great historic personalities such as Bismarck, whom we see here. And I think the 2025 campaign that had the slogan "Time for Germany." So sort of, now, like after we asked for normal Germany, now we ask for time for Germany. So very similar slogan here. But that was, among others, also in a sort of very, you could even say, we have this great word in German called Selbstverharmlosung. So like the act of trying to make yourself more harmless than you actually are. And I would say that these are two great examples of sort of trying to mobilize on maybe what you could call a feel-good ethno-nationalism. So you see a Facebook post claiming that now it's time for us, or now it's our turn, where you of course see a heteronormative ideal family with a nice house in the background, and of course everybody has blue eyes, so you don't need to say what kind of family you imagine, whose turn it is now. And on the other post, also talking about the German passport, alluding that German citizenship is losing its value because it's basically given to everyone now. So here also the idea of making your nationality valuable again is of course framed as sort of a civic, nationality, as in the passport. But what is sort of implied in that as well is of course that there are certain people whom we don't want to give our passport to, and that's ethnically defined in the end. And what I would maybe say, what the AfD has been very successful in this election, is that not only sort of anti-immigration discourses have been mainstreamed, but also sort of what I would maybe call like a feel-good German nationalism that I think we can also see other parties trying to mobilize more and more. And yeah, I would say that's one central success of the AfD, besides the making basically the migration issue a central topic in the recent elections. Yes, that's it from my parts.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very interesting. Excellent presentation. Thank you. And if anybody has questions, there's a Q&A. You can drop a question in and we'll get to it after the next two speakers. So thank you very much, Dr. Schmalenberger. And next speaker is Dr. Sabine Volk, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Passau. And today, Dr. Volk is going to be speaking about German memory regimes and foundations for the present. So,
thank you so much, Alex, for putting this panel together. Thank you to Sophie for this really fascinating talk. I have some news, namely that when I saw the poster with our different topics, I thought, I actually want to speak about something a bit different. And I changed the title and also somewhat the topic. Of course, I will be talking about AfD, but since Sophie's and my research are to some extent, have had so many overlaps that we thought, okay, well, I thought it might be more interesting to have a bit more of a diverse picture on AfD. So I will be talking not about what I did in my doctoral research, but I will talk more about my postdoc project that looks at anti-feminism in AfD, or also a bit more broadly, what it has gender to do, gender as a kind of broad notion and politicized notion. What does it have to do with the far right in Germany? And first of all, many people think, gender for AfD, is it really important at all? AfD is an anti-immigration party, maybe Eurosceptic party. And my answer to that would be, of course, yes, gender is super important, even though it is not at the focus, in the focus of AfD, or at least not all the time. But I would say AfD has always politicized gender, and I'm illustrating my claim here with a poster from the very first, very early days of AfD. Yeah, this is the Facebook post from September 2013. So that was the foundational year of Germany's now large far-right party. Back then, they seemed to be just this marginal actor that was against Angela Merkel's EU and especially the Euro politics. So they were against saving Greece in the Euro crisis. And yet already then, when AfD claimed to be only neoliberal, so to say, they already politicized gender in a very negative way. For example, here they claimed already stop the gender madness, simple truth, men and women are different. So already here we see this so-called anti-gender discourse, that speaks of gender ideology and how it has its negative impact on German politics, German society and culture. So AfD has been since the beginning really part of this international, transnational far-right network against gender. When we, from far-right studies, when we look at gender and the far-right, I think there are several interesting observations, and I will illustrate some now, also really drawing from the election result in Germany a few weeks ago. So first observation that we always make is the so-called gender gap in far-right voting. Yeah, so far-right parties, Quasimodo coined them as men's parties. And this is still the case, and this is also the case for AfD. Yeah. So in AfD, the so-called gender gap was 6% now in the recent election, with 24% men voting AfD, but so to say only 18% of women. So this gender gap exists. It is decreasing, however, which is interesting in some way, that it seems to be now less important voters' gender than it was in the last election around 4 years ago. And it seems that for women, the reasons to vote for AfD are not their politics of gender. And we could also ask, why would we even assume so? But the reason for voting AfD is also anti-immigration attitudes. So the same as for men. We can also observe this so-called gender gap in the far right when we look at the actual actors that are active for AfD. Yeah, now also in recent, like now in actual times, we see quite a difference in male and female members of AfD. AfD has only around 19% of women members, which is quite indicative of the overall social vibe, I might say. Of course, in all political parties, we observe type of gender gap. There are overall more men active in politics as representatives, as politicians, as leaders of political parties. But in AfD, this is an extreme difference. And also here, AfD is quite typical for other European far-right parties. Yeah. And then the higher we go up in the hierarchy, so to say, the less women we will find. So in this new mega delegation that AfD is now sending to Berlin in the new federal parliament, there will be around 150 people, far-right delegates. And there we find only 11.8% of women. So quite few, yeah, and that will impact the overall gender makeup of the German parliament in quite impactful ways. So the new parliament will be much less diverse than the current one. Yeah, and yet, and this is also part of my argument of AfD and gender. Somehow AfD is quite ambivalent because it has this very exposed woman leader, right, Alice Weidel, that many of you, even international, our international audience will know after her exchanges with Elon Musk. So Alice Weidel is quite a fascinating figure somehow. Yeah, she's this educated woman. She lives in Switzerland. She is openly lesbian, so she is in a civil partnership with a woman. They have children, even though AfD officially opposes same-sex marriage and also adoption rights for same-sex couples. And yet she made her way all to the top of that party. So in terms of ideas, so what AfD makes of gender issues, I think we need one key analytical concept, which is anti-feminism, yeah, which is also characterizing most, not all, but most far-right parties in the European context and probably beyond Europe. Yeah. So anti-feminism is usually understood as a reaction, so as a reactionary movement, ideological movement that opposes the processes of emancipation. So it's not it's not only about emancipation of women, but also of other gender minorities, such as, for example, gender diverse people. And anti-feminism as an ideology then has these two components. On the one hand, reactionary, and on the other hand, also trying to maintain the so-called traditional heteronormative power relations between genders in society. The current form of anti-feminism is oftentimes called anti-genderism. Yeah, we know these so-called anti-gender campaigns. I find that concept always a bit difficult to use because it's kind of nearly like an emic concept that we take from the far right. They talk so much about gender ideology, but yet it has now a firm stance as a scholarly concept. And these anti-gender campaigns, they don't come from the far right, which is well known, well traced in the literature, how such campaigns have been initially launched by religious actors, including the Vatican, but also Christian fundamentalists around the world that politicized the concept of gender, especially. And currently, many far-right actors across the world are really becoming part of this movement, of this broader transnationally networked movement that was at its beginning not as party political. Yet it seems to be, far-right actors seem to think that it really makes sense for them to join these type of networks in order to mobilize voters. Then AfD's anti-feminism or anti-genderism, I would argue that it has three main pillars. The first one is, and this resonates with one of Sophie's slides, where we could see this family, with the child, like traditional family. This is really the core of AfD's ambivalent anti-feminism. So I put here a quote from the current party manifesto, where the claim is clear that a family is father, mother, and children. There are a lot of policy proposals for these families, and it is very clear that they shall be organized according to so-called traditional gender roles. Mothers are not claimed that they should always stay home, but at least between the lines, but also in some concrete policy proposals, we can see that mothers shall be encouraged to have what AfD calls a real choice between a working life and a life as a housewife. I find this quote, even though it seems so, not in a way, it seems really expected that a far-right party would make that claim, father, mother, and children. And yet I find it interesting because Alice Weide, so AfD's leader, who, as I said, lives herself in a homosexual family with children, she actually opposed this. And at a party meeting in January this year, she tried to have the sentence deleted from the party manifesto. Yet there were more conservative party members that basically outvoted her. So we have this reference in the current manifesto and also in nearly all other manifestos. The second pillar then of AfD's anti-feminist ideological profile is what in international literature we call now trans panic. So a moral panic around more gender equality, the expansion of rights of trans and gender diverse people. AfD across Germany has all kinds of campaigns. Here on the slide, I show an example from a campaign in Saxony against the inclusion of more gender sensitive issues in school curricula. And then the third, and I would argue final important pillar of AfD's anti-feminism is this mobilization of masculinity, mostly by certain party politicians. Here I have translated one example from one of the most extreme AfD politicians, Maximilian Krah, who has a very popular TikTok account. Overall, AfD is extremely popular and successful on TikTok, more so than most other German parties. This Maximilian, he likes to give dating tips, yeah, to young men, and it seems to resonate a lot with young men. So also partially explaining the gender gap, and the overall message then of AFD's mobilization of masculinity is that real men are right wing, they have ideals, they are patriots, and that is then linked to being successful with women. Yeah, just now to finish, why would AFD adopt this anti-feminism, a somewhat ambivalent anti-feminism? We could ask, yeah, because of course now the election campaign was really dominated by immigration as an issue, yeah, and also by economic topics. So why would AFD do that? And I argue that basically this is a mainstreaming strategy that has two tenets. First, it allows AFD to build what I call anti-feminist alliances, yeah, with mainstream conservative, center-right, Christian democratic actors and the like, who also oppose the so-called gender ideology. So I am currently in the state of Bavaria in southern Germany, where actually a Christian democratic actor, so to say, initiated a ban on so-called gender language, so gender-sensitive language in public institutions, including universities. So there are a lot of bridges to build for AFD with this topic. And then second, and that will be also my last slide, second, AFD's anti-feminism simply appeals to attitudes that are widely held in the German population. And I have here on the slide some numbers from recent large-scale survey, so-called Leipzig authoritarianism survey from last year, from 2024. And in the last two lines, you can see the anti-feminist, sexist, and transphobic attitude levels across Germany. It's differentiated in West and East. In Eastern Germany, anti-feminist, sexist, and transphobic attitudes are even more widespread than in the West. Yet one can just see that in the all country, it seems to be a strategy that pays off, yeah, to appeal to these attitudes, and then also strengthening them at the same time. So this was all from me. I'm really looking forward to questions and to discussing with you. Thank you.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I know I have, I definitely have questions, especially that wild, like, horror movie slide that you showed. That was really intense, and I'm still processing it. But if anybody has questions, put it in the Q&A for now, please. And we will move on to our last presenter, Polina Zavershinskaia from the Institute of Political Science at the University of Leipzig. Polina just wrapped up her PhD dissertation and is going to be speaking about civil society and the mimetic crises. So I'm very excited to get some insight here, and I will turn it over. So thanks everybody, and on to Polina.
Thank you very much. I will also share my very ugly presentation. So maybe we can start. So basically, I will also talk about my PhD project that I just finished. And particularly, I was talking about how the mimetic crisis stimulate violence in society, and also in Germany on the example of AfD and other far-right groups, but I will talk about AfD. So yeah, and also we can speak about elections as well, because I think also what was the outcome of the elections, and we saw also this very, let's say, ugly map that basically introduced this kind of also split of Eastern German parts and Western German parts, right? Also, I think stimulated by the kind of mimetic crisis, but we can speak about first probably about mimetic crisis in civil society. So starting with civil society, we can see that different actors are present in the civil society, and these are basically the frontlash actors that we are talking about, the actors who are trying to maintain the civil solidarity, trying to expand solidarity, to solidarize with different groups, while backlash try to narrow solidarity. But both of this group appeal to this kind of, if we are talking with Bourdieu and Words, the symbolic capital of the civil society. So both appeal to the democratic values, both appeal to the, let's say, freedom, the human rights, so on and so forth. But while the ones are actually trying to expand solidarity, backlash, and AfD is a part of backlash, is trying to mimic this kind of solidarity, and by that also reduce it to sort of quasi-solidarization. So solidarization with certain groups, right? So how does it relate to mimetic crisis? And if we speak about mimetic crisis, I took a theory of René Girard, where he's talking about that, I won't talk about philosophy now, but I will briefly mention. So he's talking about this kind of mimetic desire. So people mimic the desire of other people, which is basically produce competition between them, which leads to violence in order to obtain the object of desire. In order to prevent that, the people over the centuries were basically capitalizing on the search and sacrifice of certain kind of scapegoats. And then, as we know also from the political theory, this was replaced by the certain kind of types of coercion or the state control. So here I think it's important to mention, while the frontlash actors such as democratic and actors are trying to replace this kind of polarization over goods and so on and so forth with kind of agonistic competition, backlash is trying to basically reverse that to the radical antagonism and reverse also this kind and try to find the more and more scapegoats, to say with René Girard's words. This leads what Sophie already mentioned with reversal of victim and perpetrator and polarization of different groups between each other. So which happened, for example, during the refugee crisis, where the AfD were trying to amplify that, focusing on the finding and framing with very antagonistic discourse. First, the refugees themselves, and also the government, right, and governmental measures in order to deal with that. Right, and then we also saw that during the, for example, COVID-19 pandemic, when AfD was talking about literally about that they are defenders of democracy, while the German government is locking us in the houses, right? And that's of course also led to the kind of provocation of violence against of people who supported, right, the COVID-19 measures. So for example, in Ida Oberstein, the cashier was killed by the far-right radical because he was trying to force a person to follow the COVID-19 rules. And it also led to this kind of very polarized and hateful speech in the Telegram accounts, and also, for example, the even murder plot of the Saxon government, right? And so what is also important here when we talk about the current situation is also the kind of polarization during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? And here the backlash, this also I think had very much impact on the situation that happened right now, right? Like, I mean, polarization, and using also what is very interesting, these historical metaphors in order to frame that Germany is again committing the crime and involving to the escalation, and which will lead to another German defeat. And so they were also talking about how the German government destroyed the post-war peace order, how Germany should be grateful to Russia as a USSR successor and Ukrainians to be blamed. And this, of course, also led to the very much violent language, right? Also in the commentary sections under this post, but also in Facebook, and also towards the people who were, for example, Ukrainians, were blamed to be the descendant of Nazis, right? Also in the public discourse by certain kind of individuals, right? And also in the media groups. Yeah, and that's basically, I think I wouldn't repeat myself on other points that were already mentioned, and I can close with that. If you have some questions, you can ask.
Okay, thank you, Polina. Now I know what this René Girard guy is all about. So thank you very much. It reminds me of Cassius Dio's line, "Thus we see that most men emulate the exploits of others, though they be evil, instead of guarding against their fate." We have a couple of Q&A submissions here. The first one is from Billy Mann, which is a question for Sabine. How have, or rather, have transphobic feminists, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs, complicated the definitions of anti-feminism and anti-genderism? So that one's for Sabine. And then there's a kind of a longer one that I can't read right now because it'll take a while to catch up to it.
Yeah, thank you. Now I was confused because I couldn't see the question, but yeah, it's a very interesting one, and I don't feel in the best place to answer on the spot right now. For sure, this whole turfism, it really complicates our thinking about feminism in a way. What is good? What is bad? What I can say about it is the observation that in Germany, first of all, it has not been as much politicized yet, and it has not become a political movement yet. I know that in other national, regional contexts, there are alliances between the radical right and TERFs, so trans-exclusionary radical feminists, that then really blur our distinctions. Yeah. In Germany, that has not happened yet, at least not so openly. So some journals, for example, that we might, some newspapers that we might consider being edited by TERFs, such as Emma or so, they are still really anti-AfD. But that doesn't mean that this is not going to happen anytime soon, that these new alliances will be struck and this strange bedfellows will be sought out. For sure, AfD, in comparison to other parties of the like in Europe, is even more radical, right, in their ideological portfolio, and they are radicalizing instead of becoming more moderate. So maybe that might stand in the way of this type of alliance. Overall, because the question also mentioned, yeah, anti-feminism, anti-genderism, and the relationship. Yeah, as I briefly mentioned in my presentation, I find this anti-genderism term quite difficult, and I also use it because in a way it is the overall accepted term for a particular type of discourse and movement. But I think that we should always use the term of anti-feminism as kind of the category and the umbrella term. Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't give a more conclusive answer, but I will think about it more.
Yeah, what a interesting question. And so the last question I think here is from Udip, a media student at Hochschule Darmstadt. Uh, he says, thank you for your in-depth analysis of the AfD and its political trajectory. Given the shifting geopolitical landscape, rising tensions between the EU, Russia, and China, I wanted to ask, do you think big tech influence could enable a Cambridge Analytica-style operation in Germany, particularly with the growing youth support of the AfD? Could targeted social media campaigns, data-driven manipulation, and algorithmic echo chambers push German politics further towards right-wing populism despite the country's strict regulations? Or is the German political and media system resilient enough to counter such external influence? Why don't we start with Sophie and then go in alphabetical order, and then we'll wrap up the panel.
Well, I mean, I wish I could say yes to the last question. Probably not. I mean, like the AfD. So there has not been a Cambridge Analytical operation yet, at least as far as we know. But the AfD has been very strategic in using social media to its advantage. It has in 2017 it got counseling from what were they called? I think Harrison Media, something like that, like a Texas-based PR firm that has also supported other far-right politicians and parties around the world. I think they work with Trump as well. They work with Netanyahu, and I think also with UKIP, if I remember correctly, to very strategically use social media to stir up polarizing messages. And I think they have done that ever since. As Sabine also mentioned, other parties have been rather late to the game. The AfD is very successful on TikTok, especially now. So within the legal frames, or without stealing any data or any sort of illegal manipulations, they have already been extremely successful in pushing the discourse and German public sphere towards the right. I mean, we will see what happens now with Facebook, which is they're next to TikTok, still the biggest platform, especially with like slightly older age groups. What happens, there to the fact checking and the free speech so-called regulations. And I mean, we have German legislation, we also have European legislation, but maybe I'm pessimistic, but I have my doubts whether that will be, if that the legislation is sort of able to keep up with what is happening on these platforms. Yeah. I don't know if somebody else wants to add.
Sabine, you want to take a stab at it?
Actually, I don't really have something to add to what Sophie already said. I would pass to Polina, but there is one more question in the chat that might be worth looking at after.
All right. Polina, do you want to say something about social media?
Just quickly to add to Sophie's, yes, I also doubt that the EU AI Act will try to constrain, will succeed to constrain, right, what this AfD is doing, because also this let's say, way of how they are framing their phrases is I would say, very careful in order to be still considered as, let's say, appropriate. Another thing, I think, to your question, especially about about the young voters and why they are maybe more perceptive now to AfD, I would also connect that to the narratives of AfD per se, as Sophie said, and of, for example, pseudo-pacifism, right? So trying to finish the Russian invasion of Ukraine as fast as possible, and with right, and a lot of people are buying in this narrative that if we will stop it now, if we will not continue, it will be actually, we will actually help in to this peaceful transition, right? So that might also influence why the young voters also maybe voted for AfD. But about algorithms, I am also not particularly expert in this field.
I also wanted to quickly add just a little comment to the young voters, because this is particularly striking, and there has been a lot of movement, like kind of voter migrations in these polls, under 18-year-old polls, right, that are regularly done. And with the last federal election, the polarization of young voters, so young non-voters, yeah, too young to vote, the polarization was between the Greens on the left and then the FDP, so the kind of liberal party, neoliberal economically, but also socially somewhat more liberal party on the right, so to say. And with this election this year, this has fundamentally changed in some way. The polarization has grown even further apart, and now young voters tend to vote either on the far left or on the far right, so either the left party and also AfD, and this is really worrying, I guess. And there are at least two completely opposite ways of youngsters to get to vote AfD. Some do so as something like a protest vote against their parents that are maybe for them too liberal, or so as a way of protesting against parents. But nowadays there are even youngsters that are already socialized in these kind of circles, right, where entire families vote AfD. I have heard a lot of anecdotal evidence from my students here in Passau that come from the forest region of Bavaria, that they're just entire families where everybody proudly votes AfD, and the kids are simply socialized in that context and don't even consider an alternative. So I guess political education will be key, but Germany does quite a lot in terms of political education, right? It's a really complex network of national initiatives and regional and local initiatives, but it seems that they are not so effective. So there might be some thinking needed what can be done.
Sophie, did you want to add something?
Just add one little point, because I think, with young people in particular, I mean, one thing is striking is that the left, between whom, we have this polarization that Sabine mentioned between the AfD and sort of the left on the other side, they also heavily invested in social media activities and on their TikTok activities in particular, so also, appealing to young voters. But I also think it's just also important to remember that there is actual, grievances that young voters might have. I mean, that's the COVID generation who, spent a year or two in some weird kind of study at home, not seeing your friends situation, and who were, I mean, I would say maybe objectively, I don't know, maybe not forgotten, but who actually went through a quite hard time. And who maybe felt sort of, left alone by the government or the state, and who are maybe easy targets, with several frustrations also, with the inflation in Germany and life getting more expensive, and then maybe worrying about, I mean, not so much about maybe, abstract threat of immigration, but actually about like, will I be able to afford, you know, to move out from home when I start my traineeship somewhere, or, you know, so I think without wanting to, in any way to justify to vote for extremist right-wing party, is that I think the AfD has been very successful in mobilizing on frustrations that are in some way legitimate and that have a, you know, like that have sort of origin in reality and actual yeah, I would say maybe legitimate grievances that then are channeled into, you know, not very constructive political messages.
Yeah, that's a very important point. It strikes me as an interesting kind of facet of this memory culture here, in terms of opposing some kind of return to East Germany, the DDR, while at the same time sort of feeding off of the same kind of like patriarchal positions and mounting a protest vote, seemingly against Bonn, but actually Berlin, maybe. I don't know. And but it all seems as well when you talk about the youth will be particularly vulnerable because the memory culture is now aesthetic. It's not existential. It's not a lived experience. It's something taken from or handed down by the older generation. So it can be protested or more pliable in a sense. Polina?
Maybe also about this memory culture. I'm teaching in Leipzig, so it's in East Germany. And I usually ask my students, because I'm teaching also about identity, what they are usually identify themselves with, politically speaking. And a lot of my students who are from actually the post-DDR area usually saying DDR or like East Germany, right? And they are all talking about nostalgia. So nostalgia on this kind of DDR products, on the a certain point of culture. So that was, I was quite shocking to hear, because what I was usually thinking to hear, that we are associating ourselves with kind of Europe, idea of Europe, but it was actually like very, let's say, regional identification and even expression this kind of nostalgia.
Right. Which doesn't necessarily fit. But then they're also talking about normality, right? As Sophie was, or was that Sabine? I don't remember. Memory culture. Brain fried. So yeah, this idea of normality, I was doing some research and was looking at one of the, I guess it was Junge Freiheit or something like that. And there was a chat or a section, comment section, where somebody was talking about Trump and was saying we should do the same thing here. We're learning from him. We're going to deport all the non-Germans or whatever. And which of course is this ethno-nationalist kind of definition. And things would be so normal, you know? And it's like, what normal are you referring to? You know, like you don't want East Germany situation. You absolutely don't want liberal democracy and what is construed as a legacy of West Germany taking over the East. You have this nostalgia, right? The nostalgia for the East. And
I
in
mean,
some way, there's a normal here. And maybe it's the absence of normal that's being kind of substituted with this kind of contradictory fantasy. I don't know.
I mean, I would also like, you know, I have a paper in the case study on Eastern Germany. I mean, I basically argue that the AfD is offering, if we look at Eastern Germans in particular, is offering them in a way a third way in between sort of nostalgia and sort of being the sort of the eternal, you know, the eternal nostalgic Aussie who kind of is sort of connected to be somewhat of a anti-democrat and sort of, you know, longing for the GDR. And on the other hand, they also offer a rejection of the Western German, you know, like the Western German system that brought us all the multiculturalism. because they clearly, I mean, also dissociate from GDR dictatorship and from the SED and from sort of everything that that can be connected to the GDR. They would rather say, you in Eastern Germany, you know what a dictatorship looks like because you have overcome, you know, the SED dictatorship. So you also, you know, you're kind of an early warning system, and you can see that the current government, you know, it's the dictatorship of multiculturalism. It's GDR all over again, just under sort of a different, let's say, ideological surface. So in that way, I would say, you know, they offer a third way, so to say, between. So also, but that maybe goes too far. You know, this identification of being Eastern German, in my understanding, it's a reaction to also always being labeled that from a Western side. I mean, you know, there was always, there's sort of a, since the 1990s, there's been a discourse of Eastern German backwardness going on, and this idea that Eastern Germans would have to become good Democrats like the Western Germans, and then they always failed in doing so, and they were lazy and unemployed. So, you know, like a little bit like a discourse we can see in a whole European level and how we talk about Eastern Europeans, right? So that identification as Eastern German, as somebody who also, you know, comes from an Eastern German family background today, I would say is not as much to do necessarily with nostalgia for the GDR itself. But that nostalgia, I would say, is more of an expression of remembering a common heritage that maybe also, like, you know, something we had in common that wasn't, that we don't imagine to be less worthy than what Western Germany had. So it's in a sense a little bit apolitical and not so much nostalgia for the political system, but more sort of everyday, as Polina also said, consumer goods, right? Like chocolate bars or coffee or like certain things we would consume or my parents would consume in their youth, which sort of brings this feeling of, you know, the past that we share that is not so much, they wouldn't remember how they were all standing, you know, during the, what do you call it, Fran appel, you know, like during some political ceremonies or singing the national anthem of the GDR. It's more sort of this everyday cultural experience, which again I would say is an answer to a certain marginalization within reunified Germany, where they've always been constructed as the other Germans who ideally at some point, you know, end up being just as good as the Western Germans. Sorry, that was a little bit of a sidetrack rant, but
it makes perfect sense. It makes me think about the idea with a lot of reactionary movements that there's been a revolution betrayed, or a sort of a potential that's been lost, right? The lost potential of the nation, that people are often going back to the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the wall and the big movement to overthrow the Soviets, right? Or Soviet influence.
As
And
part of the campaign, I mean, they were literally claiming, one slogan was like, complete the turnaround, as we called it, complete the fall of the wall, essentially. So like exactly this idea that there was a chance and we were betrayed of that chance, and now's our time to make it right. So yeah.
Almost like a stab in the back narrative. So okay, I don't think that I should keep talking, and we've kind of turned this into a very interesting conversation, which will hopefully continue in many ways. Oh God, there's another question. Is there? Perception of the sense from the traditional far right to AfD's popularity. Are they emboldened? So the traditional far right, like the NDP, is that
Yeah,
NPD? And yeah. Are they emboldened and feel aligned, or are they mainly skeptical and see the AfD as sellouts, another form of Zionist puppets, etc.? I think we can all agree that the far right is on the rise in any case. So that's really interesting. What about these kind of like Nazi parties that have emerged and gone away over the decades?
Well, they have gotten more marginal, right? This NPD, so the kind of classical neo-Nazi party, it doesn't play a role at all anymore. Yeah, even in regions where it used to be strong, like Saxony, so also in Eastern Germany, where it even had some seats in the regional parliament for some time, some years ago. Still, AfD is not the only player in town, right? There are even new extreme right parties that have emerged, especially during COVID, that have the strong conspiracy leaning, yet they cannot really compete with AfD. It's a really interesting thought if they would see AfD as what did you say, a Zionist puppets? I wouldn't know. There's one also a really fringe, tiny neo-Nazi party, not NPD, but it's called Dritter Weg, Third Way, that has yet a bit of a different take, and they are quite, for example, they are quite critical of AfD, and to some extent would feel emboldened, even though it's hard to say because they are so tiny, but they get even some votes here and there. But a dividing issue there is also the Russia-Ukraine question, right? Because Polina already hinted at that as well, that most German far-right actors, they are pro-Russian, pro-Putinist even, and they have adopted this narrative that Ukraine is, basically they have adopted Russian propaganda, right, with painting Ukraine as this Nazi, undemocratic country. And this Third Way, this party that I mentioned, is an interesting exception. So they are very pro-Ukrainian. Of course, they are still also not pro the Ukrainian government, but they are for Azov and kind of Ukrainian nationalist formations and paramilitary groups. But so there are some dividing lines between AfD and other far-right actors. Yeah. I don't know if Sophie or Polina have something still interesting. I guess you would have some more insights as well.
Maybe just quickly to say that still, for example, far-right AfD, right, and also movements as Pegida and Identitarian have occasional alliances, for example, during some events, or right, we could see that also Scandal, that Compact basically described in Potsdam, right, where they still collaborate on some kind of issues. So, but regarding of framing AfD negatively, I honestly don't have any idea about that. But on Ukraine, I think that it's a good point, because if to talk about AfD is also trying to represent this kind of forgotten, or as Sophie said, misrepresented groups. And that's why this narrative and adoption of Russian propaganda plays a very important role, because they are also representing this kind of a group of Russian Germans. Right, so for them, streamlining of this narrative of Ukraine plays important role, while for others it can be also viewed negatively, as you said, with Dritter Weg.
I also, I mean, everything, like the little I've seen of the NPD, I mean, I think they've merged like with the Republicans, and they call themselves Die Heimat now, like the homeland, but they are like, I mean, I think that merge has also widely gone unnoticed because they basically don't play a role anymore. But what I've seen is basically them trying to argue, hey, you know, we are the real deal, not the AfD, sort of, yeah, unsuccessfully. So I think they sort of, yeah, basically just try to argue how they are the hardcore, you know, nationalists and not the AfD. I think they might still play a role, like on a very, very local level, in some, you know, very rural areas, especially where they used to also organize, you know, rock concerts and sort of music events. They might sort of, you know, still be of some kind of importance to a local neo-Nazi group. But there has been, as Polina also mentioned, like there's connections sort of like in terms of persons who maybe, you know, were affiliated with the NPD in one way or the other, and I now happen to work for member of parliament of the AfD. So there's been several cases where, you know, investigative journalists have looked into the biographies of individual assistants of AfD politicians and sort of uncovered, let's say, rather questionable ties to neo-Nazi movements.
Okay. That's really interesting. I was watching Tucker Carlson interviewing this supposed military expert, and one of the things that Carlson said was, you know, I love Ukrainians, but I hate the Ukrainian government. It's completely evil, you know? And I think that maybe that's kind of on this level that you're talking about, in a sense of like supporting, being pro-Ukraine, but against the government that's there. At the same time, Carlson is very kind of pro-Putin in the sense, and he was extraordinarily depressed, it seemed, about the apparent ceasefire proposal. He didn't, because of course he wants peace, but this is just so that Ukraine can rearm and that kind of thing. But it does kind of, I mean, we'll see what Russia does, but it transforms the narrative that the pro-Russia side wants peace, the pro-Putin side wants peace. Anyway, I have to stop there. I have a pretty hard stop right now because I have to go teach a class. But sorry, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining. And thanks to all the audience who came, those of you who have stuck around and asked questions and everything. Really appreciate your time. And yeah, round of applause on here for the panel. And we'll keep in touch over the next few weeks or months about future webinars that Fran will do.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much for putting us together and for the interesting questions.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.